Hello and welcome to this time of Bible study. I want to start something new today. I want us to take a walk through the Bible together. We'll begin with a study of Genesis and go on to each book of the Bible. We'll be studying from the King James Version for this because it is a public domain version of the Bible. There's no copyright to it, so I don't have to acquire permission to use it. And it's a version of the Bible that most people are familiar with. We'll begin today with an introduction to the book of Genesis. This will be a slow study. I only want these videos to be about 5 minutes each, so we won't cover a whole lot each day. And no, we will not go through the Bible in a year. We're going to move a little bit slower than that, but 5 minutes a day every day will not take up much of your time, and I hope will prove to be beneficial to you. And I want to encourage you, if you do have a Bible reading plan of your own, do not abandon it for this, but use this in addition to that. In the book of Genesis, we read of the beginnings of the earth and of man. Nowhere else does man read so honestly and so truthfully about his or her beginning. Understand that the book of Genesis is more than a book of history, and it's more than a book of science. Like the rest of the Bible, it is indeed a book of inspiration. Truly, in every sense of the word, it is the Genesis. It is the beginning. There are several beginnings that we do find in the book of Genesis. We find the origin of the universe in the first 25 verses, and starting in verse 26 of chapter 1 and going through verse 25 of chapter 2, we read of the origin of man and woman. In chapter 3, in the first 7 verses, we read of the origin of sin and of death. And in chapter 3, starting in verse 8, going through verse 24, we read of the origin of the redemptive promise. And then in chapter 4, the first 15 verses, we read of the origin of sacrifice. And then starting in verse 16 of chapter 4 and going through verse 29 of chapter 9, we read the origin of civilization. And then in chapters 10 and 11, we read of the origin of diverse languages and nations. And then in chapters 12 through 50, we read of the origin of the Jewish nation through whom the Messiah would come. There's several events that happen in Genesis that are noteworthy. Many of the Bible stories that we heard from our youth happened in the book of Genesis. We read of the creation in chapter 1. We read of marriage being instituted in chapter 2. In chapter 3, we read of the temptation and fall of man. In chapter 4, we read of the first murder being committed. In chapter 7, we read about the great flood. In chapter 11, we read of the Tower of Babel. In chapter 12, we read of the call of Abraham. In chapter 13, we read where Abram and Lot had to part company from each other. In chapter 19, we read where Sodom and the cities of the plain were destroyed because of their iniquity. In chapter 22, we read of the great trial of Abraham. In chapter 24, we read of Isaac and Rebekah. In chapter 25, we read of Esau's birthright, the one that he gave away, that he traded away. In chapter 28, we read of Jacob's ladder. Chapter 29, we read of Jacob and Rachel. In chapter 37, we read of Joseph being sold into slavery. He's in prison in chapter 39, but we read that in chapter 41, he rises to rule Egypt. In 46, we read that Joseph and Jacob are reunited. In chapter 47, we read of the death of Jacob, and in chapter 50, we read of the death of Joseph. So Genesis is indeed a book of beginnings and a book that has a lot of stories that we're familiar with in it. It makes it an interesting book for us to study. We'll begin with the first verse today. Genesis 1 verse 1 says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." God is eternal, and sometimes eternity is something hard for us to grasp, that God has always been and always will be, but that's the truth. He always has been, he always will be, and in the beginning, yes, there's a time that was the beginning of this world. God was there and he created it, and God, as we read about in this verse, is used in a plural sense. He is the Father, he is the Son, he is the Holy Spirit, and he created the heaven and the earth. That is, there was nothing there, and he created it out of nothing. Big Bang theorists say that there's this two specks of dust that collided, and the explosion created the earth and the atmosphere and the galaxies and such. Folks, where did that speck of dust come from? There's nothing there. God created this world and the universe. Heaven and earth here does indeed refer to the universe. There's 3 heavens we read about in the Bible. There's the heaven where the birds fly, it's referred to in Jeremiah 15 verse 3. There's the heaven of the galaxies and constellations. We read about it in Isaiah 13 verse 10. And then in Psalm 11 verse 4, we read of the third heaven. That would be the heaven where God lives. But here we see that God created the heaven and the earth, that he created them out of nothing. And we see earth singled out here, singled out from the other planets, because, folks, till this day, earth is the only place where life has been discovered. And so earth is special. It is a special creation in God's universe. I thank you for watching today, and I hope you'll join us as we look more in the book of Genesis and continue our walk through the Bible. Thank you for listening today. Please share this with a friend of yours so that they too may make the walk with us. And we invite you to worship with us at the Bearden Church of Christ. We meet in Bearden on Cedar Street, 745 Cedar Street. If you're coming from out of town, that's Arkansas Highway 203. We meet on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. for our Bible study. Our worship service follows at 11 a.m. and we have evening worship at 5 p.m. We also have midweek Bible study Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you, and we invite you to come be a part of us. Goodbye. I love you, and God does too.